Throughout the Middle Ages, warfare in Western Europe centered on fortified strongholds. Castles and walled towns dominated wide stretches of surrounding land, and their garrisons, especially mounted troops, had a large operational reach. From these bases, defenders could protect territory, launch attacks, raid enemy lands, forage, and disrupt movement. For any invading army that seriously aimed to win a campaign, these fortified hubs of resistance had to be confronted and neutralized first. Yet castles and walled towns were specifically engineered to resist capture, raising an obvious question for attackers. How were they supposed to be taken? There were several methods for overcoming a medieval fortress, but this discussion focuses on the most common approach siege warfare presented. Here is a 9-step guide to laying siege to a medieval stronghold. The opening move typically involved dispatching a fast-moving mounted advance force, which approached the target town under cover of night after a forced march. Speed and surprise were crucial, as this maneuver denied defenders the chance to prepare properly. Ideally, a town would have no time to stockpile supplies, strengthen defenses, or call in reinforcements. On very rare occasions, such an advance force even succeeded in capturing a town outright through a sudden coup de main. Far more often, however, attackers established themselves in a secure position nearby and began harassing the surrounding area, raiding farms and villages, ambushing merchants, and capturing laborers. These activities, commonly described by the technical terms small war or chevauchée, had serious consequences. Morale within the town declined, goods grew scarce and expensive, and food reserves dwindled even before a formal siege began. James the Conqueror, during his campaign against Valencia in 1238, described this initial phase as the ripening of the town, likening it to fruit that must mature before it can be eaten, before moving on to the metaphorical peeling and consumption of that fruit. It is useful to pause and consider medieval sieges more generally. When people imagine a siege, they often picture a long, dramatic struggle filled with massive siege engines, relentless bombardment, and towns reduced to rubble before finally surrendering. While such sieges did occur, they were actually the exception rather than the rule. Most medieval sieges were far less spectacular and ended before they truly escalated, sometimes due to a successful surprise assault or clever stratagem, but more often because the defenders surrendered early or because the besieging army was required elsewhere. Understandably, medieval chroniclers, modern historians, and popular media tend to focus on the rare cases where both sides showed extraordinary determination and fought to the bitter end. This account does the same, selecting those dramatic examples, even though each siege was shaped by its own unique circumstances. Despite this variety, the fundamental methods of attack and defense remained largely consistent across the Middle Ages, at least until gunpowder artillery transformed siege warfare in the 1420s and 1430s. These enduring principles allow the complex reality of sieges to be simplified into a typical, idealized example, one that may never have occurred exactly as described, but still conveys the general nature of medieval siege warfare. Since most sieges were directed against walled towns, and since these did not differ dramatically from castles in defensive structure, this idealized siege focuses on a fortified town and is set before the widespread use of effective gunpowder. Artillery. Once the town had been weakened sufficiently and the main army arrived before its walls, negotiations usually began. Successful talks could save time, money, and lives on both sides. For the defenders, however, surrender was a delicate matter. They needed to show at least some resistance and be certain that no relief army was approaching before giving up, or else risk the wrath of their own lord. At the same time, holding out too long could provoke brutal consequences, including harsh punishment or a violent sack of the town by the attackers. To balance these risks, defenders often arranged a truce for a fixed period. If no relieving force appeared within the agreed time, the garrison would surrender the town. If negotiations failed, however, the siege formally began. At that point, events moved quickly. The besieging army often attempted an immediate and improvised assault, trying to storm the town by scaling the walls with ladders or rushing through a gate while defenders were still disorganized. This is what happened at Béziers in 1209, when Crusaders campaigning in southern France against Catharism encountered a moment of opportunity. As the besieging army was still establishing its camp, the defenders launched a careless sortie. Mercenaries fighting for the Crusaders seized the chance, forced their way through a gate as the defenders withdrew, and were soon joined by the main army. The town fell within hours. According to tradition, the attackers followed the chilling motto, "Kill them all, God will know his own," and most of Béziers' population was massacred, while the town itself was burned. Such rapid assaults were extremely risky and often resulted in heavy casualties, but the prospect of a swift victory was tempting. Defenders might be unprepared, making success possible, especially if the town lacked natural defenses like cliffs, water barriers, or a protective ditch, features that were common around medieval fortifications. When no fortunate circumstances like those at Béziers presented themselves, attackers first had to deal with outer defenses, or sometimes fortified suburbs. According to historian Peter Perton, who devoted nearly 1,000 pages to medieval sieges, these outworks typically consisted of earthworks, wooden palisades, or even timber walls reinforced with packed earth and coated with mud to resist fire. And bombardment. Advancing through these outer defenses was difficult, but the greatest challenge remained the main wall itself. Assaulting a massive stone rampart several meters high using only ladders was a near-mad undertaking. Still, the potential rewards were enormous. Individual soldiers had the chance to win fame and distinction, even if the assault ultimately failed. For commanders, success meant ending the siege quickly, an appealing outcome, since every additional day drained money, supplies, and lives. At any moment, a relief army might arrive and force a battle, or disease could sweep through the besieging camp. A hasty assault was therefore a classic high-risk, high-reward gamble, one that predictably failed more often than it succeeded. The defensive advantage of the walls was overwhelming. Attackers had to advance under fire, climb ladders, and then fight their way onto a well-defended wall walk, while arrows, stones, and other missiles rained down on them. Defenders also hurled a wide range of dangerous objects, from spiked logs to beehives and even corpses. While such methods are vividly portrayed in modern popular culture, they were probably used less frequently than often assumed. The use of hot oil or tar is especially disputed among historians. A specialist in ancient siege warfare, Rolf H. Berendt, considers it largely mythical, arguing that boiling water would have been a more practical substitute. By contrast, historian Clifford Rogers suggests that hot water would have been less effective, as it cooled rapidly when poured from the height of the walls. However, no serious historian disputes that the most frequently used defensive weapon was probably the simplest one of all: plain stones. Rocks were cheap, easy to obtain, and brutally effective. Being struck on the head by a falling stone was more than enough to stop any attacker instantly. Even if a soldier managed to climb to the top of a ladder without slipping, getting hit by an arrow, or having his skull crushed by a rock, the ordeal was far from over. He still had to haul himself over the battlements, while at least one defender was striking him at close range. And even if one or two men-at-arms succeeded in gaining a foothold on the wall, they would immediately find themselves surrounded by enemies trying to kill them or hurl them back down. In rare cases, these attackers managed to hold off the defenders, just long enough for a few comrades to join them on the wall walk. It was precisely this slim but real possibility that made hasty assaults seem worth the risk. If these attempts failed, or if circumstances made a rapid assault impossible from the outset, the attackers eventually had to accept that the town could not be taken quickly. At that point, preparations began for a prolonged siege. This meant establishing a fortified camp, organizing guard duties and watch posts, and securing a constant flow of supplies. All of this required enormous labor, especially during the early phase of a siege, when the threat of major counterattacks was at its highest. Such counterattacks, known as sorties or sallies, were sudden strikes launched by defenders against the besieging forces. They were one of the strongest tools available to those inside the walls. A surprise sally offered the advantage of initiative and often succeeded in dealing a sharp blow, particularly if it managed to destroy siege engines or collapse mining tunnels. During the Siege of Orleans from 1428 to 1429, for example, an English fort called Saint-Loup blocked French reinforcements from reaching the city. A sortie from Orleans distracted the fort's garrison just long enough for reinforcements, under the leadership of Joan of Arc, to slip past in boats and enter the city through the eastern gate. Even when the besieging army had a strongly fortified camp or a complete circumvallation, a system of walls and ditches encircling the town, the risk of sorties remained high. Defenders often managed to seize supplies or kill horses during these attacks. The constant threat forced besiegers to station large numbers of troops as guards around the camp and siege engines at all times. Early in a siege, when defenders were still fresh and camp defenses incomplete, as many as a third of the army might be tied up on guard duty. This meant rotating the entire force through 3 8-hour shifts simply to contain the garrison. In some cases, attackers even constructed forts or blockhouses in front of gates and sally ports, protected exits specifically designed for launching sorties. Despite all this, the most critical factor for the safety of the besieging army was a well-fortified camp. Building such a camp was considered a high art of warfare and was closely supervised by the army's commander. James the Conqueror famously wrote that while kings should remain in the rear during battle, they should be at the forefront when quartering their army in order to position their men effectively. Choosing the right location was the first step. The site needed to be dry, flat, and close to water, ideally a river or stream. This eased sanitation, supplied water for drinking, cooking, and washing, and significantly improved defensive prospects. The camp could not be too far from the town, but also not dangerously close, and it ideally included a suitable area for constructing siege engines. Camp and engines needed to remain near each other, since both were prime targets for sorties. Once the location was chosen, tents and huts were laid out in rows, typically centered around the commander's tent and an open assembly space. The camp was then fortified with palisades and a simple ditch. Pragmatically, waste pits and garbage trenches were often incorporated into these defenses. The defenders of Acre learned the unpleasant consequences of this practice during the siege of 1291, when a nighttime sortie drove off the outposts. As one account describes, the attackers reached the tents, became entangled in guy ropes, and one knight fell into a latrine trench and was killed. In some situations, more than one camp was required, for example, when a river flowed through the town. This forced attackers to divide their forces, increasing risk. To reduce this danger, armies sometimes undertook massive efforts, such as building bridges. Beyond security, supply was the greatest concern. As siege warfare expert Jim Bradbury noted, supplying distant campaigns like sieges was particularly difficult. Large armies required vast amounts of food, and there was no easy solution for the first few days. Carried provisions and local foraging were usually enough. After that, armies relied on 3 main options: wide-ranging foraging expeditions, supply lines from friendly territory, or cooperation voluntary or coerced from the local population. Supply from home was the most reliable if secure routes existed, especially by water, which was much faster than land transport. However, supply convoys were popular targets for allies of the besieged city, requiring extensive escort duty that often fell on the cavalry. Such systems were logistically complex, and clear examples of them functioning well only appear from the 13th century onward. Foraging, by contrast, demanded huge manpower, exposed troops to ambush, and remained unreliable. This uncertainty was reflected in camp market prices. Successful foraging meant lower prices, while delays or failed expeditions could leave even a simple infantryman unable to afford bread. These camp markets also helped integrate local populations into the supply system. The lure of profit attracted merchants and suppliers, who brought goods directly to the camp or sold them through camp merchants and civilian followers trailing the army. In ideal circumstances, this created a steady flow of supplies, especially food. To protect the system, soldiers were strictly forbidden from robbing merchants. Sometimes locals were forced to supply the camp. Other times they did so willingly. Whether motivated by fear or profit, regional populations often played a major role in sustaining besieging armies. While some soldiers constructed the camp, gathered supplies, or stood guard, others prepared the next defensive phase. This usually combined bombardment, mining, and renewed negotiations. The aim was to reduce the defender's advantage by damaging walls and gates. The backbone of medieval artillery consisted of stone-throwing machines such as mangonels and traction trebuchets. Stone was the standard ammunition, though debris, corpses, and very rarely incendiaries were also used. In the 12th century, the counterweight trebuchet joined this arsenal. Unlike traction trebuchets, which relied on crews pulling ropes, these machines used massive counterweights. They fired only a few shots per hour, but each impact was far more powerful. Both types were often deployed together. Smaller, faster traction trebuchets pelted the town with a constant rain of stones, while the slower counterweight trebuchets hurled massive projectiles with devastating force. The destructive potential of prolonged counterweight bombardment was demonstrated during the siege of Acre in 1191. After weeks of bombardment by attacking forces, the walls of the Crusader-held city began to crumble. One machine, known as God's Stone Thrower, reportedly smashed a 30-foot gap into the upper wall. Although the base remained intact and still posed a major obstacle, this example shows that counterweight trebuchets could inflict serious damage. Even so, historian Clifford Rogers argues that before effective gunpowder artillery emerged in the 15th century, siege engines generally caused limited harm to solid stone walls. Breaches usually required long bombardments, and some fortifications simply could not be broken at all. The Chronicle of Lanarcost even mocks the defenders of Dunbar in 1336, claiming they wiped away the marks left by enemy stones with a towel. Despite these limitations, trebuchets remained among the most effective siege weapons of the medieval world. They were especially effective against fortifications made from less durable materials and against weaker sections of a defensive system, things like wooden facings, breastworks, hoardings, machicolations, or sometimes even flanking towers. If these vulnerable components could be smashed or stripped away, the wall lost much of its value as a fighting platform. Another frequent target was the town itself. In many cases, attackers hurled more stones over the walls than directly at them. This tactic caused extensive destruction inside the town and placed enormous psychological pressure on the civilian population, which could spark unrest against the garrison and ultimately force a surrender. Still, the most reliable way to bring down a solid stone wall was deep mining. Miners and sappers would begin digging from a covered position, cutting a tunnel all the way beneath the wall. There, they excavated a large chamber under the foundations. The wooden supports holding up both the tunnel and the wall above were then soaked in oil, and the chamber was packed with flammable materials. Once ignited, the fire slowly weakened the supports until they gave way, causing both tunnel and wall to collapse. This method was used, for example, at Rochester Castle during the First Barons' War between 1215 and 1217. The castle had been seized by rebellious landowners commonly known as the Barons, and was later besieged by King John as he sought to crush the uprising. This siege famously inspired the 2011 film Ironclad. As shown in the movie, King John's miners tunneled beneath the southeast corner of the keep, filled it with brushwood, and in reality, the carcasses of 40 pigs, and set it ablaze. The fire destroyed the supports, bringing down a substantial portion of the keep. Even under ideal circumstances, however, deep mining was a painfully slow process, often taking weeks or even months. If the ground consisted of solid rock or the water table was too high, mining could be extremely difficult or downright impossible. Defenders also fought back by digging countermines and setting up listening posts in cellars to detect underground activity. Sometimes they even used bowls of water to observe vibrations caused by digging. Once enemy miners were detected, defenders did everything they could to disrupt or destroy the tunnels. While this underground war was unfolding, work above ground continued. Ditches or moats had to be filled so that battering rams, siege towers, or mobile armored shelters, often called SEOs, could be brought up to the walls when an assault was launched. Although siege towers were fairly common in prolonged sieges, they were not used in the vast numbers or dramatic ways often depicted in films and video games. According to medieval military technology expert Kelly DeVries, their primary function was to protect and elevate archers and crossbowmen, not to serve as direct boarding devices. That said, there were exceptions, such as during the fall of Jerusalem. In 1099, typically, siege towers were built on site and designed to rise higher than the walls, allowing crews to fire down onto the defenders and suppress the return fire. This suppression made it possible for infantry to climb ladders and for miners to work closer to the base of the walls. Most towers did include a drawbridge, and some even featured a battering ram at ground level. Still, siege towers were not vehicles that could simply be driven up to the wall. They had to be pushed or hauled forward slowly, making them unsuitable for sudden assaults. After all, they were movable towers, not machines of speed. DeVries estimates an average advance of about 30 meters per day. The greatest weaknesses of these towering structures were fire and stone. As Sean McGlynn puts it, they had an unnerving tendency to collapse or topple. Stone throwers could smash them apart, rendering them useless, and even though they were usually covered with wet, raw hides, they could still catch fire. When that happened, the crew inside often burned alive, more robust than siege towers were, whose heavy wooden frames had to support the immense weight of the ram itself, typically a massive tree trunk suspended by ropes or chains. Reliable depictions of medieval battering rams are rare, and written sources usually mention them only when something unusual occurred, such as fitting the head with an iron cap. In many cases, rams were sheltered beneath a roof, also covered in hides. This structure could withstand a barrage of small missiles, or remained vulnerable to large stones and incendiary substances. Even so, rams were mainly effective against weaker targets. As DeVries notes, wooden gates, even thick ones, and portcullises were vulnerable, but no matter its size, a battering ram was unlikely to seriously damage stone walls 2 or 3 meters thick. On such fortifications, Clifford Rogers adds, one almost gets the impression that rams were used more to show that every option was being tried, And to unsettle the defenders, because anyone truly expected them to achieve decisive results. While engineers prepared siege engines, miners dug their tunnels, and soldiers strengthened the camp, the army's leaders were far from idle. They deliberately used the highly visible threat posed by these preparations to pressure the defenders into surrendering. If that worked, it was a perfect outcome. The attackers gained an intact town without draining their finances or exhausting their troops in a drawn-out siege. For defenders, the promise of lenient treatment in exchange for a quick surrender was equally appealing. In fact, many of these preparations were designed as much to terrify the defenders as to enable an actual assault. While such intimidation might fail against particularly determined garrisons, there were usually individuals inside who stood to lose more than others. Often, a pro-surrender faction emerged, or a traitor was willing to help the attackers gain entry. A classic example occurred during the siege of Antioch in 1098. Bohemond of Taranto made contact with an insider, an Armenian Christian named Firuz, who held a senior position in the city. In exchange for money, titles, and protection, Firuz arranged for a group of crusaders to scale the towers of the Two Sisters, where he was on guard duty. They then opened a nearby postern gate, allowing their comrades to flood into the city. The surprised garrison was overwhelmed, and Antioch fell section by section. The outcome was grim. During the subsequent massacre known as the Massacre of Antioch Crusaders, and local Armenians slaughtered thousands, including Firuz's own brother, while negotiations between leaders were usually conducted with a certain degree of decorum. The common soldiers and townspeople engaged in their own verbal warfare. The insults they hurled at each other, often shouted across the walls, can sound like a crude rap battle to modern ears. They typically focused on wives, children, and starvation. "Surrender, fools, lest you starve, and we take your women." Or, "Your wives will hardly mourn you, since they'll soon have plenty of bastard children." Amusing as this exchange may seem today, it spoke directly to the deepest fears of soldiers far from home, or civilians trapped in a besieged city, facing the very real danger of a sack. Improvisation played a huge role. Alongside these long-term efforts aimed at pressuring the defenders into a quick surrender, attackers often tried their luck with nighttime. While success was unlikely, if the town maintained an effective watch, long hours of guard duty gradually exhausted the defenders. A sentry might nod off or lose focus. Even when such attacks failed, they served a purpose. Each one reminded the defenders that they could not repel every assault forever, and that a town taken by storm usually suffered far worse than one that surrendered in time. As a result, every assault slightly increased the chances of capitulation. Unlike small raids, a major assault could not be hidden. Its preparation unfolded in full view of the defenders. Ceremonial acts, religious services, the dubbing of new knights, and loud proclamations all contributed to a carefully staged display of menace. This spectacle was often more persuasive than any threat or negotiation. It was the entire army flexing its collective strength. When banners were raised and formations took shape, it was as if time itself paused. Defenders were usually offered one last chance to surrender, and surely many weighed their options carefully. If they refused, the assault began. Trumpets and drums shattered the silence, signaling the end of waiting. War cries echoed, horns blared, banners tilted forward, and the men advanced. Protection mattered more than speed, so heavily armored soldiers led the charge. Alongside armor and shields, attackers carried or pushed wooden screens for extra cover. They followed the same deadly path as in earlier assaults, through a storm of missiles, up to the wall, climbing ladders or siege towers, and onto the wall walk. If the first wave failed, new waves followed until exhaustion or other circumstances forced a halt. Meanwhile, The slow, massive siege towers creaked forward under constant fire. Both armies watched in tense anticipation. Defenders cheered when a stone struck its target and groaned when it missed. During the siege of Acre, attackers were known to celebrate wildly when enemy stone throwers appeared to miss, only to discover, too late, that the trebuchets were hurling pots of flammable liquid. Flaming arrows soon ignited a tower, and its crew perished in the fire at the same time. Archers, crossbowmen, slingers, and other missile troops took up positions at a safe distance, protected by mantlets made of wicker and wood. On the walls, each opening in the battlements was assigned to multiple shooters, creating a dense barrage that forced defenders to keep their heads down. This was why the elevated platforms of siege towers proved especially useful, providing suppressive fire from above. The assault was fully multidimensional. While infantry charged the walls and missile troops provided cover, miners worked beneath wooden shelters, hacking away at the foundations in an effort to undermine the wall itself. Breaking through a defensive wall was extremely difficult, especially when it was constructed from massive, solid stone blocks. In such cases, attackers had very little chance of success. However, there were situations where progress could be made, particularly when walls were built from materials like mud brick, adobe, or earth-backed masonry. In those instances, besiegers could carve out a cavity, either digging deeper to undermine the foundations or attempting to weaken the structure directly at ground level. Even then, the odds of creating an effective breach remained low, though history shows that it did occasionally succeed. A successful breach was most often achieved through extensive mining beneath the walls. Once an opening had been created, the next step was to storm it, but this was not always immediately possible. Rubble and collapsed masonry frequently blocked the passage, sometimes making it completely impassable. Clearing debris was often unavoidable and came at a high price, as workers had to be paid extra for performing such dangerous tasks under enemy fire. Even after the passage was cleared, broken walls and scattered debris remained serious obstacles. Moreover, breaches and open gates formed narrow choke points. Only a limited number of attackers could pass through at any given time, and those men would usually be met by the defenders' most experienced and elite fighters. All the while, they were exposed to stones, arrows, and crossbow bolts raining down from nearby towers and walls. Attacking bowmen were at a further disadvantage, as they lacked elevated positions and often could not fire effectively without risking their own comrades. How heavily this situation favored the defenders is illustrated by cases where they deliberately left gates open as a trap. Entering through a breach was terrifying. Success was uncertain, and losses were typically severe. Because of this, assaults on breaches often became decisive turning points in a siege. Sometimes, commanders needed considerable effort to persuade their men to attack at all. A famous example is James the Conqueror's siege of Medina Mallorca, modern-day Palma de Mallorca, during the Spanish Reconquista. After weeks of tunneling, the attackers finally opened a breach in the city wall. James spent 4 full days preparing for the assault, arranging his seasoned infantry in the front and positioning the knights behind them. Every man was required to swear an oath that he would not turn back, even if wounded. Yet when the signal to advance was given, no one moved. Only after 3 separate calls to action did the army finally begin to advance. When they entered the breach, they faced a dense formation of spearmen waiting for them. For a time, neither side dared to initiate the attack. Eventually, the knights pushed forward, driving their horses straight into the enemy pikes. The first wave was repelled, but the second managed to force its way deeper into the breach. There, the fighting stalled completely, with soldiers on both sides packed tightly into the confined space. A final mounted charge eventually broke through the defenders, and soon after, the city fell. If negotiations failed, Bombardment proved ineffective, and mining produced no decisive result, and it became clear that even the fiercest assault would not succeed. The besiegers' final option was a complete blockade. The siege then turned into a contest of endurance, aimed at draining the defenders' supplies and weakening them until they were forced to surrender. However, this strategy carried serious risks and expenses that not every attacking army could afford. While blockades played a role in all stages of siege, warfare by preventing reinforcements and supplies from reaching the garrison, they now became the primary method. If it had not already been done, besieging forces would attempt to isolate the town entirely, usually by constructing a circumvallation. This involved building a ditch, an earthen rampart, or both around the city, which had to be guarded continuously. Efforts were also made to disrupt water supplies, such as destroying aqueducts, blocking conduits, or even diverting rivers and streams, because surrounding and starving a city could take an extremely long time. Siege camps were reinforced and supply systems stabilized. In some cases, these camps expanded into settlements resembling small towns, complete with defensive walls, wooden buildings, marketplaces, craftsmen, brothels, and shops. As food shortages worsened and hunger spread, pressure inside the besieged city intensified. Internal tensions grew, as suffering was not shared equally. Unlike ordinary townspeople, members of the garrison often had a castle to retreat to, and usually lacked families or homes within the city. The attackers were well aware of this imbalance and attempted to exploit it, hoping to stir unrest among the civilians or persuade someone inside the walls to betray the defenders. If discipline was maintained by the commander and the garrison, starvation and thirst eventually claimed lives. In such desperate circumstances, extreme measures were sometimes taken. To stretch dwindling supplies, defenders occasionally expelled those deemed useless mouths, such as children, women, and the elderly. A compassionate besieger might allow them to pass through, but a calculated tactician would not. This forced defenders to either watch their own people starve outside the walls or consume their remaining food, reserves to keep them alive. One such event occurred during the siege of Rouen in 1417. According to historian Juliet Barker, around 12,000 people were driven out of the city. These refugees were forced to live in the ditches throughout the winter. The scale of suffering was so severe that it reportedly unsettled even the English besiegers. Hunger and disease threatened both sides. Poor sanitation, improvised sewage systems, and limited access to clean water allowed illnesses to spread easily, sometimes causing casualties greater than those of an open battle. Avoiding epidemics during a siege required careful preparation and a great deal of luck. The same dangers applied to overcrowded cities, although disease appears to have been less common among the besieged, possibly because they enjoyed better shelter, established sanitation, and immunity to local microbes. Generally, a siege ended in one of three ways. The attackers abandoned it, the fortress was taken by force, or the defenders surrendered. Even when surrender was agreed upon, the city was not immediately handed over. Treaties often included a conditional respite, granting defenders one final opportunity to appeal to their lord for relief. During this period, a truce was enforced: no fighting, no repairs, and no hostile actions. If no help arrived within the agreed time frame, the city keys were formally presented, and the victorious commander made a ceremonial entry. Depending on how the town had behaved during the siege, it might simply change hands or be looted. If civilians surrendered without the consent of the garrison, the defenders might burn the city from their refuge to punish what they viewed as betrayal. More often, however, the garrison either made a final stand or negotiated separate terms, surrendering their fortress in exchange for safe passage, personal belongings, or even departure under arms with banners flying. If a town was captured by storm, its worst fears were often realized. Victorious soldiers, sometimes openly encouraged by their leaders, frequently treated inhabitants with extreme brutality, viewing looting and violence as their rightful reward. This was especially severe when deep hatred existed between the two sides, such as during religious conflicts. Where slavery was permitted, the desire for profit often replaced pure bloodlust. Unfortunately, historical sources usually describe these moments only vaguely, with phrases like, "everyone was put to the sword." Still, evidence suggests that, after an initial surge of violence, soldiers typically killed only those who resisted. After a short period, often around 3 days, the sack was usually brought to an end. Survivors were then allowed to submit to the new ruler, and in many cases, remain in their homes. In some instances, however, inhabitants were expelled, their properties redistributed, or entire towns burned to the ground. Please use the information presented in this video thoughtfully and responsibly. Only plunder villages, bombard cities, or undermine fortifications when absolutely necessary.